Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. Today I am joined by Nelson Hsieh, who is Research Associate for... help me with your job title again.
Text and Language.
Text and Language. Why can I not get your job title right every time? I think so far in this series I've got it right once without being prompted by you. But there we are. A major achievement of this podcast series will be that I finally learned what Nelson's job title is. Anyway, welcome back. We don't have Dirk with us this time, but we are continuing in our series on manuscripts of the New Testament. And today we are going to talk about divisions in the text, textual divisions. Now, my understanding with the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, we have that out and published, but you're working on a second edition. And one of the changes between the first and the second editions, which we were talking a little bit about in our last episode. Well, we were talking about the Greek New Testament as a whole in the last episode. But just at the end, I think we talked a little bit about the divisions, the paragraph divisions and those kinds of things. How are you changing things between the first and the second editions of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament?
So in the first edition of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, obviously the focus was on creating the new critical text, but they did set aside a few months' time to consider the issue of paragraph divisions. And largely the methodology that they followed was basically they picked the three earliest manuscripts that covered, almost the whole New Testament and had paragraph divisions all throughout and not just a couple here and there. So that would be Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus from the 4th and the 5th centuries. So that's three manuscripts. And they just went through the whole New Testament, and if like a majority vote, so if 2 out of the 3 or 3 out of the 3 of those manuscripts had a paragraph, then they would print a paragraph, even if it was sort of in a strange or weird different place than other editions and translations. They would print it to represent what the manuscripts were doing with paragraph divisions. Now, there are some difficulties, like, for example, what if all three, have them in different places and they don't agree at all? Sometimes the paragraph division might not be entirely clear. So you get some difficulties. And then, of course, that's only three manuscripts. If we consider the manuscripts that we have, let's say up to the 6th century, then we have about 10 to, depending on the book of the Bible, we have about 10 to 15 manuscripts that we can draw from rather than just 3. So in the second edition of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, the current research project has been to do a more systematic and comprehensive study of paragraphing in the earliest manuscripts and to use sort of a more refined methodology, more data from more manuscripts, each of them studied carefully for their own habits, how the scribes did paragraphs, the habits, and then to make adjustments and revisions to the paragraphing for the second edition. Sometimes they'll stay the same, and then other times there'll be some adjustments, taking out some, adding some. But it's basically a more comprehensive and systematic study of paragraphing in the earliest manuscripts to make changes to the second edition.
Okay, that's great. Now, right back in episode 2, which was just with Dirk, we talked about what manuscripts look like, and I confessed in there that I had been brought up to believe that there were no paragraph divisions or word divisions or anything like that in the Greek text, and that's not quite true. So that needs a little bit more nuance, but just talk us through, Dirk introduced this a little bit, but just talk us through the ways that paragraphs are divided in these manuscripts. So when you're comparing these 10 to 15 manuscripts for the second edition of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, what are you actually looking for? How do you see those divisions?
Yeah, so there is, if it's not carefully put, there's a statement that kind of becomes like a myth to where so the oldest manuscripts were written without spaces in between the words. And I mean, that's generally true. But from time to time, a scribe would leave a little blank space that's about the size of a letter with, let's say, so a centimeter or something like that. Sometimes that might have just been I don't know, maybe that's a mistake, but sometimes it was probably more intentional to leave, a good sized space, because it's sort of like fish in water, right? You get so used to reading text with no spaces between words that when you do introduce a good sized blank space, that something's happening there, right? Yeah. That in those cases, it becomes closer to maybe our modern full stop or our modern comma without obviously using our full stop and comma. Yeah. So they become sense divisions. Mm-hmm. And we see this in, for example, P46 from the 3rd century, a manuscript that contains most of Paul's epistles. So there's nothing like what we would call a paragraph division in that manuscript, but there are some rare punctuation marks, and there are these little spaces right. That are left. Now, in other manuscripts, also from the 3rd century, P66 and P75 contain portions of Luke and John. In those manuscripts, we do have something that we would call ekthesis, where ek is from the Greek word out, take something out. Whereas today, when we create a new paragraph, right, we indent into the main text. Yeah. Here with ekthesis, they would outdent. Right. They would move the text out into the margin, into the left margin, usually one letter out in the margin. Sometimes that one letter would also be written much larger than the others to make it very clear that that's what's going on. So we see that in P66 and P75 from the 3rd century, but it's not yet systematically applied to every page of the manuscript. So, for example, in P66, over about 100 pages of text encompassing John chapters 1 to 14, 100 pages of text, 14 chapters of text, you get about 12 or 13 paragraphs, which is not very many. And most of them are clustered earlier on in the text. So you have some, but it's not very much. It's not systematically applied at that time yet.
Any ideas why it's not systematic in that kind of way? Or was it a change of scribe, or was he behind schedule and just didn't think about it?
It could be a couple of factors. Some scholars would guess that maybe they were, copying these divisions from another manuscript, and initially, the scribe was very attentive to copying all of them. And then maybe eventually he started just focusing on copying the text and was sort of ignoring the divisions. And that's why maybe you have a lot of divisions early on, and then it starts to fade away. So it could be inconsistent copying of the divisions just scribal fatigue and just focused on the text rather than the textual divisions. It could be that the scribe was creating them and would only pick places where, sometimes the text itself guides us to structure, first, second, third, finally, Paul will say something like that, to where, the structure is clear from the words itself. And so a scribe felt like you don't really need to put a division there because the text kind of divides itself. And then in other places, or it's not so clear that there's a division or structuring of the text, and maybe they just pick and kind of like picking and choosing your battles. You pick where you think it's significant, or there is a transition that's not so obvious from the words of the text itself.
Yeah. This may be a red herring question, I'm not sure, but one of the things I've noticed in Codex Sinaiticus is that as well as the ekthesis, there are also some little lines just on the margin. What are those paragraph divisions, or what are those lines doing?
Yeah, so you had ekthesis, which is similar to what we do. It's just in the opposite direction, indenting, outdenting. We have a manuscript of Deuteronomy, Septuagint Deuteronomy from the 1st century BC. So this is even before New Testament times. We have this manuscript which, adds these little horizontal lines sort of partly in the margin and partly within the text. We call this, not to be confused with modern paragraphs, but the Greek word for this little horizontal line is a paragraphos. marking.
Right.
And that little line would indicate to the reader that, okay, there's some sort of break on this, where I'm marking this line. So basically, that Deuteronomy manuscript in the 1st century is already using that. We have some examples from 1st century papyri that are using that. The 3rd century papyri that I mentioned, P46, 66, 75, they don't use paragraphoi, or that would be the plural. But in the 4th century with Codex Vaticanus, the scribe who wrote the New Testament, the scribe who wrote the Old Testament preferred to use ekthesis. And then the scribe that wrote the New Testament, and then some parts of the prophets in the Old Testament, he or she preferred to use this paragraphoi mark.
Okay.
Where, you draw a little line. Codex Sinaiticus is a little bit different. It does mix the two. Although from my look at it, a lot of times when the little lines will come in was the main scribe used ekthesis, and then the little lines will come in if there's an Old Testament quotation. It will be marked off with a paragraph at the beginning or the end, as well as little diplay caret marks. In the Gospels, Codex Sinaiticus includes this cross-referencing system among the 4 Gospels called the Eusebian canons or the Eusebian apparatus. And a lot of times you'll have a Eusebian section marker in the margin, and then I think the same scribe who added those section divisions also added the paragraphos mark next to that section division, just to make it clear that this is where the Eusebian section belongs. So each manuscript is different. Sinaiticus, I think those paragraphos marks are more or less secondary to ekthesis, whereas in Vaticanus it is primary. It's the main way that the scribe uses it to indicate paragraphs.
Okay. So just picking up on Eusebius, you mentioned his dividing the Gospels into sections, episode 4 maybe, when we were talking about how the early church handled differences between manuscripts. So is he the first person to kind of label chunks of text that enables you to find your way around and to cross-reference things?
I don't think he would have been the first, but certainly he would have been very early, because this would basically be, late 3rd, early 4th century. Now, of course, this is only the Gospels, so not the Old Testament, not the rest of the New Testament. It's just the 4 Gospels. And Eusebius' system is technically not really a structuring device as it is a cross-referencing device. And what I mean by that is sometimes you'll just have one little tiny detail in a gospel text, and he'll have a section, not because it's really part of the literary structure, there's some movement, but just because it's a little detail in this gospel, and another gospel also has that tiny little detail, and I want you to be able to find it. So a lot of his sections are more tied to cross-gospel relationships than it is necessarily to how is Mark himself or Luke himself, what's the literary flow of that text itself. Eusebius is not really as concerned with that in creating his system. So some of them are, they follow the contours of the text, but a lot of them are just little details. But Codex Vaticanus from around the same time has probably the earliest system of numbered chapter division. So not just paragraphs, but the paragraphs, from time to time have numbers next to them so that you can, reference and navigate to that section. And those divisions, Charles Hill has a book that he published recently entitled The First Chapters, and he argues that that's probably the earliest system, and that it's probably drawing upon divisions that were created in the 3rd century and is continuing that textual tradition. So Codex Vaticanus probably has the earliest numbered divisions of the text.
Right. Wow. And what's the story then between those first chapter divisions in Vaticanus through to the first kind of modern chapter and verse things to today? I mean, that's a massive question to ask you, isn't it? Let's go from Vaticanus to the medieval period to start with. So the Paris Bibles you've written about in an article on the Ink Tyndale House website for Ink magazine. We'll come back to that in a second. What's the story between Vaticanus and getting to the Paris Bibles?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, it's helpful just to start with the fact that we are like fish in water. We're so used to our modern Bibles and the way that they divide up the text for us, the chapter system. You know, in America, there's this sort of trendy parachurch ministry where they called themselves Acts 29. You know, because the idea is Acts has 28 chapters.
Right.
You know, and we're continuing, you know, the apostolic, missions. So Acts 29. But there were other efforts at dividing up the text of Scripture into numbered chapter divisions far earlier than that medieval system. So Codex Vaticanus is basically the earliest example. And some of these systems divide up Acts into like 60 chapters. So Acts 29 as a parachurch ministry wouldn't make sense. I think Acts 29 would probably be in something like Acts 5 or something like that, you know. So that only works because we're so anchored to our current 28 Acts chapter system. So numbered chapter divisions sort of split into a Greek tradition and a Latin tradition. So the Greek tradition starts with Codex Vaticanus, whose divisions are quite good from looking at them.
What do you mean by good? They're in sensible places.
They're in good places.
Right.
They're not excessively high to where it's closer to, you know, sentence divisions, and they make them in good places, sometimes interesting places. Unfortunately, Vaticanus doesn't cover the whole New Testament, Revelation, last part of Hebrews, and the pastoral epistles. Right. Philemon are missing, so that's unfortunate. But this Vaticanus system doesn't win the day. It doesn't get popular. As far as we know, there's only one or two other surviving manuscripts that have the same system. Codex Sicintius, can't remember, from 7th century or something. Gospel of Luke has the same divisions, and then a few in the Old Testament that have the same divisions. So it never becomes popular. It doesn't win the day. Starting in the 5th century with Codex Alexandrinus, we have a system of divisions called the Old Greek divisions for the Gospels. And then for Acts, Catholic epistles, Pauline epistles, a guy named Euthalius creates a system of chapters and titles to go along with them. So not just chapter divisions, but titles to summarize each of these chapters.
I assumed that was a really modern thing.
No. Yeah, this goes back to the 5th century titles. Some of them are really long that they would not fit. They wouldn't put these titles into the main body of text. They put it into the upper margin or the lower margin.
I see. Okay.
So these could be really long. I mean, they could be 20 or 25 words long titles to summarize. Some of them are kind of strange. Some of them are interesting. But so this is 5th century. And that system by Euthalius and the Old Greek system in the Gospels does end up permeating the Greek manuscript tradition, so that now we have, hundreds, probably, we have so many manuscripts with this Euthalian Old Greek chapter system that we don't even actually know exactly how many we have. It's basically, hundreds, thousands of manuscripts have this. So that dominates the Greek tradition. And then therefore, among the Orthodox monasteries in which these manuscripts were held.
Right.
So in the Greek tradition, we really just have two main systems, and one wins the day decisively.
Yeah.
In the Latin tradition, Hugh Houghton wrote this article on the Gospel of John, where he documents 16 different division chapter systems for the Gospel of John that range in the number of chapters from about 36 chapters, which is already longer than our current, 21 chapter John that we have now, up to like over 60 divisions, 60 chapter divisions. So it becomes a bit of a confusing mess if you have all these different chapter systems and there's no one agreed upon way of referencing and navigating through Scripture. So by the 13th century, you have a couple of different things happening to where it becomes basically really important and necessary to get onto one unified system. So in the 13th century, we have the rise of universities to where if you have a professor and you have students, and you're going to study scripture together, I mean, you literally need to be on the same page so that when the professor says, turn to John chapter 5, it needs to be the same John chapter 5 in everybody's Bible.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The other thing that we have happening is just the very luxury of every person in the classroom, every person in the pew having their own Bible. That was not a luxury that was afforded to people throughout most of church history. Most of church history, you just sort of had the church's copy of the Bible, and then wealthier people might have a copy of the Bible, and that's it. But once everybody has a Bible, all the students, all the people in the pews, then again, it's the same issue of if you're, as the preacher or the teacher, going to say, today we're going to study John chapter 11, there's got to be a unified way of that happening. So that, and then the third thing is with a Bible reference tool called a concordance. So concordance basically takes some word in scripture. It could be a person's name like Abraham, or it could be a concept like faith or grace or something like that. And if you wanted to know, let's say, the name Abraham or the concept grace, what is every occurrence and where does it occur? And if you're going to give that kind of information, right, it helps to have some, unified way to find all the passages with a single word.
Yeah, you don't want to say somewhere about a third of the way into Romans, do you, for a reference?
That makes it difficult, especially when you're just looking at one word.
Yep, right.
So because of those factors, a professor at the University of Paris named Stephen Langdon, who eventually becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, he created a system roughly in the early 12th century, and that system ended up becoming popular and winning the day. And we still use it today. Right.
And that was first appearing in the Paris Bibles, which were the first kind of single volume Bibles in general distributions. Am I understanding?
At a cheap, popular level. I mean, so like with Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, we have basically a very large, very expensive, it wouldn't be a pocket-sized sort of Bible. But the Paris Bibles become very popular, and that's often how you win. If you make an idea or something that becomes very popular, even if it's not necessarily good, you end up winning the day. And it was because the Paris Bibles adopted his chapter system that, largely he won.
Okay. So is Stephen Langton to blame for the fact that some of the chapter divisions are in the wrong place? I mean, I'm always both amused and frustrated that the first chapter division you get to in the Bible, I mean, we're talking Old Testament. I know we're supposed to be talking about the New Testament, but Genesis 1 ends in the wrong place. Is that Stephen Langton's fault?
Yes and no. I mean, he claims to have gotten some of the divisions from Latin Bibles from, centuries earlier than himself, but obviously he's basically responsible for the final product. Now, it's not totally standardized. The printers, the publishers are still kind of making small adjustments, and we have a number of lists where his chapters systems are written down, and there's still some final adjustments to be made. Like I think John has 20 chapters instead of 21 chapters on one of the lists. But I mean, it's largely him, but he is taking from something before it. But I guess we could lay the blame at his feet.
And other people have developed it further, as you're saying. So what the chapter divisions we use are not all Stephen Langton's, presumably.
But these are very small tweaks. Okay, this is just one verse.
Right.
And that could be a Scrabble error where, Acts chapter 8 actually starts like one verse earlier or one verse later. Like very small tweaks, not any major changes after that.
Are there New Testament examples that strike you as being particularly egregious? This is not in the right place.
I mean, I don't know if I'd necessarily say egregious, but
no, that was a very loaded term.
I think there's a good example in Acts chapter 6 Langdon's Acts chapter 6 through 8, where basically we have this extended story presented to us about Stephen, who is martyred, and he gives this great long speech or sermon, and his story basically gets chopped up into 3 different parts. Some of it in 6, most of it in 7, and 6 is only 15 verses. Chapter 6 is only 15 verses. Chapter 7 is 60 verses, so it's really long. And then chapter 8, really just the first few verses are still part of his story. But the Langdon divisions obviously chop it up so that, for example, if you did a sermon series or you had a Bible reading plan or something like that, you would basically get his story in 3 separate days or 3 separate sermons, because it gets all separated out. Both Codex Vaticanus And the Euthalian system, they actually keep Stephen's story all together as one, basically from chapter 6, verse 8 to chapter 8, verse 3. It keeps his whole story together into one division. So it gives you much more unity of theme, topic, and person, whereas our division of Acts 6, 7, 8 really chops up his story.
Yeah. When I was a student worker, I used to do what we call manuscript Bible study with students a lot. So I'd just print out the text with no chapter divisions, no paragraph divisions, and give people a big long chunk of text. And it was really interesting how people would see things in a different way for the first time because that apparatus was taken away. So the chapter divisions, they affect the way that we read the text, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. Unconsciously often, and we're like fish swimming in water, and we're not even sort of aware that this is happening.
Yeah. So do you think it's really important that we give more thought to those divisions and what they're doing, or should we actually find some new way of referencing and throw them all away?
It's impractical to change at this point. The system that we have, all of our commentaries and everything, it's really impractical at this point. I think it's just helpful to be aware that, this doesn't come from the biblical authors to where, it has, divine authority that these chapters and verses, we have to follow them. I think it's helpful just to realize that this is the work of biblical scholars, and they interpreted the text and tried to bring out the structure of the text based on their chapter and verse divisions. But like any biblical scholars, they can make mistakes or not interpret it in the best way possible. So we should just feel comfortable with saying, appreciate what you've done, but let's look at some other systems and let's just study the text itself to see the structure that arises from the text itself.
Yeah, right. So let's just go back very briefly before we finish, because we're probably a little over time already. But just go back to what you're doing with the Greek New Testament, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Why do you feel it's so important to go back to these early manuscripts and try and reflect their paragraph divisions in the light of what you've just been saying?
I think sometimes we have this C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, where we sort of look back at, a book published 50 years ago as sort of, that's, that scholarship is too old. Or a book published 100 years ago, God forbid, it would probably be out of print. And as a scholar, why would you, or a commentary or something, why would you consult something that old? And we're going to manuscripts that, in some cases are 1,500 years old. But I think there's a lot of value going back to older sources that are not of our time period, where they saw things differently, they thought of things differently. And when we look at some of the divisions that these scribes were making, a lot of times when I've been studying them, initially I'll think, this is kind of weird or awkward or strange. And then, just to point people to a resource, I wrote an article on John chapter 1 in Inc. magazine, paragraphs in John chapter 1. And when I first saw how the manuscripts were dividing up John chapter 1, I did think it was awkward and strange and it struggled to make sense of it. But after I studied the text itself more carefully, I realized, no, the scribes were actually onto something in terms of, if you read the article, I talk about John the Baptist's testimony gets brought out more emphatically by the way that the scribes divided up John chapter 1. And I think we realized, these scribes were not, they were smart and they studied scripture. They knew scripture well. And I think they were doing something that even if we still end up disagreeing with the manuscripts and the scribes, it's still worth giving them a seat at the table in these discussions. Let them speak. Let them, show what they're doing. And it's oftentimes different than what we're doing. And if we decide we still not going to follow them, that's fine. But at least we gave them a seat at the table and we can have a conversation basically with them in terms of how we structure Scripture and how we understand how it proceeds and flows.
Brilliant. Well, I think we better draw this to a close. Thank you very much, Nelson. We'll put the links to those two articles by you, one on the chapter divisions. We didn't really talk about verses, did we? But there's a bit about verses in your article and the more recent article about dividing up of John chapter 1. We'll put those in the show notes so you can find those. You know what I'm about to say now. Please rate and review us and tell others about us. Introduce the podcast to all your menagerie of pets, any aliens who come visiting. Just let the world know about the podcast. Thank you very much, Nelson. It's been fun to do this series. Thanks for joining us.